Pour yourself a sweet tea, pull up a lawn chair, and turn the page with us. You're listening to Right On Mississippi, a podcast taking you inside the minds of America's most treasured wordsmiths. I'm Sarah Ulmer, and Right On Mississippi is produced in partnership with Mississippi Public Broadcasting for the Mississippi Book Festival, the South's Literary Lawn Party. Thanks for tuning in with us today. We have a very special guest all the way from the Big Apple. Miss Rozan is here with us today. S.J. Rozan is here to talk about a book that is coming out next month, her book, Paper Sun. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited about this.
Absolutely. All right. How was your trip down? Are you doing okay making it through Mississippi heat?
Oh, yeah. I came in a couple of days ago, and I've been to Clarksdale and Greenwood and Cleveland and, getting around the Delta.
You're hitting up all of our good small towns in the Delta, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm trying to, yeah. I have a guide,
good.
my friend Eric Stone, who lives down here, and he's in Clarksdale, and he's a big Delta fan. So
well, there's so many good things that come out of the Delta. I don't know how you couldn't be a big Delta fan. Yeah. But that's also great. I love, like, when I vacation, I love meeting somebody local that knows how to take me to the good local spots.
Yeah.
And in Mississippi, it's the nook and cranny places that have the best stories to tell here. Yeah. Well, thank you for being here, and let's just get right down to it. So talk to me about this new book, Paper Sun, which is part of a series that has been taking a little bit of a break. So I know readers that have been in this series are very excited to see this book coming out.
And I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, this is the 12th book in the Lydia Chin, Bill Smith series. And the way the series works, Lydia Chin and Bill Smith are private eyes. And Lydia will narrate one book, and Bill will be the sidekick. And then the next book, he will narrate, and she'll be the sidekick. And this has been going back and forth for years. And I wrote a couple of other things, and that was there have been 2 breaks. But I was down here visiting Eric a couple of years ago, and he introduced me to the story of the Chinese grocers of the Mississippi Delta. I had never heard of these people. I had never heard of this community. And because Lydia Chin is Chinese American, she lives in Chinatown, New York with her mother, and a lot of her stories are focused on Chinese themes. And when I heard about the grocers, I thought, boy, if I was ever handed a story on a silver platter to make into a book for Lydia, this is it. And so I went back to New York, and I did a whole bunch of library kind of research, and I came back down here, and I talked to some people, some of the grocers who are still here. I went back to New York and met a bunch of people up there. I came back here, and then I finally, after the 3rd trip, I wrote the book, and it's called Paper Sun, and it comes out July 2nd.
That is very exciting. Like we said, a lot of people that have been following her story and the story of her and Bill Smith are able to kind of get some more insight. And being a Mississippi native, love that you are looking at a culture that probably doesn't get a lot of attention in the Deep South. I feel like that's something that doesn't get talked about. And here in Jackson as well, we have a Mr. Chin's.
We just came from there. We had dumplings and greens.
And how good was it?
Oh, it was excellent.
It is.
Excellent.
And the grocery store that they have over there is awesome. I've lived overseas. I lived in the Philippines for a little while. And just walking in kind of reminds you of just that Asian culture and that feel of everything. Yeah. So for readers that might not be familiar with this series, can you talk a little bit about kind of where this idea came from and this storyline to focus on this particular culture, not just in Mississippi, but in New York as well?
Well, when I created Bill Smith, who was the first character I created, he was that iconic voiceover white male private eye. It's an icon. It's Robert Mitchum. There's lots of them. But when I started writing, a lot of the private eyes had sidekicks who were exactly like them, only psychotic. So if the private eye wanted something done that he didn't want to dirty his hands with, he could just call the sidekick and say, gee, I wish someone weren't shooting at me from up in the hills. And the sidekick would say, just stay where you are and come over an hour later and, dust the dirt off his hands and say, taken care of. I didn't want Bill Smith to be able to do that. I wanted him to have to deal with morally ambiguous situations. And if there were only two bad choices to choose between, I wanted him to have to make one choice and then live with it. So I wanted him to have a sidekick, but somebody who was as different from him as possible, so that everything could be called into question. It had to be somebody small because he was big. It had to be a woman because he was
clearly.
a man. And and then I decided, well, it really ought to be somebody from another culture, and that way everything, when the new year starts and what you have for breakfast and whether or not you wrap presents and just everything is a matter of debate, and there is no firm moral ground.
Right.
So that was my thought. So I created Lydia Chin, but to be a sidekick for Bill. And about a third of the way through my first book, it became clear that she was not going to put up with that forever. That she would do it, but then she wanted her say. And I thought, well, it really is a waste to have spent so much time creating this character if I don't give her books of her own. The reason I chose a Chinese-American character is that I grew up in New York, and I've always been interested in Chinese culture, Chinese food, Chinese art, Chinese music. I don't remember the first Chinese opera I heard, but I love Chinese opera.
Wow.
Most people kind of draw the line there. I love it. So I figured, okay, I would make her Chinese-American and then start to study all the young Chinese-American writers and all the artists, and to see what would be on her mind, on Lydia's mind. And I did that. And by the time I was ready to write a book for her, I thought I kind of had the character down. And I have a bunch of Chinese-American friends, and I would call them up and ask things. They would invite me over, and their mothers would feed me and then laugh. You know, white people don't eat that. Yeah, okay. You don't tell me what's in it, and I'll eat it. And it was really a lot of fun. And so that's where Lydia came from. So with her, I can explore questions of culture in a way that with Bill I really can't. But with Lydia, because she was born here, so she's a young American, but in a Chinese environment. So she lives with her mother, even though she's certainly old enough to move out. She's 28. But her 4 older brothers have moved out, and it's her job to stay home with Mom, make sure she's okay. The brothers pay the rent. Mom doesn't get to make any rules about when Lydia comes and goes, although she does keep trying. And it lets me explore issues of family, which I think are hugely and underappreciatedly explored in American, especially in crime fiction. So that's what Lydia does. And there are an infinite number of Chinese themes that you can look at, or Chinese-related themes. But that's one of the reasons I was so surprised when I found out about the grocers of the Delta, that I thought I pretty much had at least a sketchy picture of where the Chinese had been when they started coming to this country, what they did, all the different Chinatowns up and down the East Coast, and the railroad workers in the West, and San Francisco. And I thought, the valley where they had farms until they were burned out. I thought I knew all that. And then to find these guys, 100 years of grocers in the Delta that I never heard of, that a lot of my Chinese friends in the East never heard of, and that certainly almost every white person in the East had not heard of. And also the other thing you need to know about us Northerners, us Yankees, is that when we learned American history, the South, and especially the Deep South, was a story of black and white. And the fact that there were Chinese, Jews, Italians, Lebanese, none of this ever, even Native Americans were never mentioned. So this was to me a kind of astounding light bulb moment. And I thought, I have to write this book. So I did.
And I think that's, as a Southerner, one thing, we have bad in our past. We have good in our past. But I think that's one thing that almost kind of, it's this cloud of mystery over the South, is because a lot of people are not aware that there's so much more culture and there's so much more that happened than just the Civil War or just blacks and white. There's just so much more going on down here. I remember I went to Massachusetts once, and someone asked me, "Do you wear shoes to school?"
Oh, you're kidding.
I mean, genuinely asked
as young
me
as
that.
you are, she's really young, folks.
Oh, well, thank you. And genuinely asked me that, and I just had a ball with it. I said, "No, what are you talking about?" And then, asked me, and I'm talking crazy questions about things like that. So I always love when someone sees something about the South that is worth writing about, that kind of opens a door to show that there's so much going on down here, and we appreciate, as a Southerner, we appreciate anything like that. So as you're investigating this Chinese culture and learning more about it, was there anything that, even if it's a little simple thing, that just was incredible to you, that is a difference in your culture than Chinese culture? Anything that just stood out that you thought was pretty interesting to find out?
Oh, you mean in the Chinese culture in general?
Correct, as you were doing research for these books.
Oh, for the Lydia books in general?
Yes.
Interesting question. I think as focused as Jewish American families are on family, and because that's my background, the Chinese are even more. And what they have that we don't have is a kind of unbroken family lineage. They can go back to the home village. A lot of them can go back 20 generations. Wow. They know the names of their forefathers, and they have ancestor tablets, and they have written history. And that kind of long sense of history kind of amazed me, because we don't have that. And,
no, I mean, we have Ancestry.com, and unless you're doing that, we're kind of all at a loss.
Yeah, you know your grandfather's name, and maybe his father's name, maybe.
Right.
But probably not.
Right.
And that's it. As
and
Americans,
even if you know the name, you don't necessarily know where they came from.
Right.
And where they originated from either.
But the Chinese tend to, even if they have been in this country 100 years, they know where the home village was, and that really impressed me as a different way to look at time.
Absolutely. That's very cool. So coming to becoming a writer, you had a different career before then. You did some architect work on some places like police stations, firehouses, zoos. So how did you go from that to writing?
That is a great question. When I was a kid, I was one of those little kids who was always going to grow up to be a writer.
Okay. I know those kids. I do.
Right. I was always writing stories and poems and making up things. But when I went to college, I was suddenly struck by the idea that you can't just be a writer just because you want to, that you have to do something useful. You have to do something socially valuable.
Right.
You can't just sit around and write.
But that is socially valuable.
Well, yeah.
But at the time,
but at the time I thought, no, who am I to just sit in a room and write? So I became an architect because it is socially valuable, and I really enjoyed it. But the reason, as I think about it, as I've thought about it a lot since, the reason what I liked about architecture was not this ability to design, which is what a lot of people, to put their mark on things and stuff. What I liked is that if you are a trained architect, you can look at a room like this, at a building, and say, I know why that is like that. I know what's behind that wall. I know how this works. And I was always looking for the secret. I was always looking for the answer. And that is the same instinct that led me to be a writer and a crime writer. So I was going to be a writer, but I went into architecture, and I graduated, and I got a job. And luckily for me, it was a really good job. It had everything you might want in terms of creativity, in terms of people I was working with, in terms of responsibility, in terms of my boss, who was very supportive of women in the field, which was
that's awesome.
It's still a problem.
Yeah.
And yet, after 8 years of being at this firm, I realized I wasn't happy. And because I knew it was such a good job objectively, and that there wasn't anything that I could do as an architect that I wasn't getting to do in that job, I realized it wasn't the job, it was the career. And the little voice in my head started saying, well, weren't we going to write a book a long time ago? Wasn't that the idea? So I thought, okay, let me try this. And if it doesn't work out, I can think of yet another career to have. And so I started writing. I took a class, and I realized it was really hard, but it was fulfilling in a way that nothing else was. And I thought, okay, that was a detour, but this is really where I need to be. It took me another probably 15 years.
Oh, wow.
Not quite that long. Yeah, that long from the time I started writing, not that long from the time I started being published. But I had a number of books published already by the time I left architecture.
Okay.
I had started to work more and more and more part-time. One of the interesting things that happened is that my entire architecture career was in that same firm. So as I began writing and began thinking, gee, I would like to leave and put my full weight down as a writer, I was getting higher and higher in the firm. And they thought they needed me more and more. I was getting to be the institutional memory. And they kept saying, oh, you can work more part-time. You can come in only afternoons. If you have to go on a book tour, that's fine. Just go. And so it was very hard to leave because they
didn't want you to.
They didn't want me to
really
leave.
did.
And they were making
I'm sitting here thinking, that's a dream
I
setup.
know, it was. It was terrific. But finally, and this was after 9/11. I had to then write a book about 9/11 because I couldn't write a book about anything else.
Right.
And luckily for me, it didn't feel lucky at the time, but luckily for me, I was between books. So I didn't have to go back to a book that I'd been writing on September 10th, which a number of my friends did. But I didn't. So I started this September 11th book, and I realized that if I wanted to write the kind of books I really wanted to write, I had to fully commit. And a friend of mine put it this way. He said, you are holding on to the rail, and you're skating around holding on to the rail, and you don't know whether you can do the fancy tricks out in the middle of the ice until you let go of the rail and go out there. And maybe you can't, and maybe you'll fall, but you won't know until you try it. And I thought, well, I do not want to die wishing I had tried it. So I finally told my boss, I really do have to leave. And he said, no. And I said, I live down the block. You can call me.
Just call.
And so I went back and forth for a long time. I would go in and show them how to do something that had been one of my expertises. But I became a full-time writer at that point.
I think that's hard for a lot of people to understand because it's not always that you're at the rock bottom or that you've gone to so many dead-end jobs and then you decide to follow that path of creativity or follow your dream of what you thought you'd do. Sometimes you're in the great job with the great coworkers and you still are not fulfilled.
Yeah.
And you have to still do what you feel like you're called to do.
Yeah, and that's at that point that's when it's hardest because if you're in a dead-end job, you're not going to be sucked back into that. But in a job that's really good and you're thinking, what, am I crazy?
Right.
I'm really going to leave this? But that's also when you know that something else is calling you, because if everything is that good and you're not happy, then that's not where you're meant to be.
When I'm sure growing up also or working in a society like New York, which is very career driven, and to walk away from a good career to be a writer, which is hit or miss. I mean, there's some people that make it and some people that don't.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm sure that's a difficult, especially as a woman. I'm sure that's a difficult decision to make, but I'm sure all of us could say we're grateful that you made that decision.
Well, thank you. I am too.
Right. So talk to me a little bit about, you said you always knew you were going to be a writer. What kind of books were you drawn to as a young person? What did you always read that, may or may not have influenced how you write now?
Yeah, totally. It totally did. I read crime. I would get a new Nancy Drew book for my birthday and for Hanukkah every year, and I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait for my new Nancy Drew book. I read some of the Hardy Boys. They weren't. The trouble with them is there were too many of them. It was two of them.
Too many to keep.
Right. And I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. And adventure. I read Robin Hood. Robin Hood, the Howard Pyle Robin Hood, which has beautiful drawings in it, was the first book I read that I realized at some point, wait a minute, if I was at the second to last chapter, and I thought, if I finish this book, it will be finished. It'll be all over. There won't be any more. Well,
Don't you hate that feeling?
Yeah.
Hate that feeling.
And it was the first time, and I thought, should I not finish it? But why would I? There's 2 more adventures. Why would I not finish it? But if I finish it, then I want. And it was just a big thing. What I read were books where things happened, and that was what I really loved. And I always wanted to write crime. I would watch crime TV shows, and I was reading these crime books. And when I got older, when I was in high school, I was reading a lot of fantasy. That was when I read Tolkien and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The Narnia books. I don't know that people read those anymore.
Love some chronic. They're still big down here. I will tell you
good.
that. C.S.
And Lloyd
Lewis.
Alexander, is he big down here too?
I don't know that I'm
Prydain, the Chronicles of Prydain.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know the Chronicles of Narnia. I mean, I have had people in school in gifted classes bring up Chronicles of Narnia as reading books. So those are still going around
good.
today.
I am so glad. And so that was what I read. I read where things happen, where there's risk, where there's danger, where people have to step up and do the right thing, or else terrible disaster happens. But they're regular people.
Right.
And so now before that, when I was a little kid, I used to read comic books. I used to read Superman and Batman.
Nice.
Love them.
What's your favorite comic book here? Are you at DC or are you Marvel?
I have to admit that I am now Marvel, but I started at DC.
Oh,
I started with Superman.
It's okay. I can forgive you.
You can live with that.
Look,
Okay,
don't get me wrong. Marvel has some great movies out there, but
the movies, right?
my
but the
heart
books,
will always belong to Superman.
Mine kind of will too, because I was so young when I started reading them. Yeah.
I get it. I definitely feel that.
So when I started thinking about writing, it was always crime that I wanted to write, because crime novels, and especially murder, but crime in general, it's important. Something big has happened, and you have to do something about it.
Right.
It's not an emotional issue. It's not a choice, and especially when it's murder, somebody's life has been ended. That's major, and they can't tell you anything about it. They're dead.
Right.
So you have to be the one, or the detective has to be the one, to at least get some kind of justice. I mean, what justice can there be for someone who... But
something keeping you on the edge of your seat, waiting to see, is the victim going to be avenged by whatever, information is found out.
Something, and it moves, and it's important. And that's why I always... And you can talk about social issues in crime. Crime novels are a lot more nimble than mainstream novels. And so a social issue comes up. There was, I don't know if you remember this, but in Connecticut, it's got to be 20 years ago now, there was a school bus full of children that was kidnapped. The entire school bus was kidnapped and held for ransom. And 2 years later, which is about how long it takes to write and produce a book, there were 3 books in which a school bus full of children gets kidnapped.
Of course.
That it's that kind of thing you can react right away.
I feel like even crime in the news, it draws something out of people. People want to know.
Yeah.
They want to find out what's going on. And so, I mean, I myself gravitate towards crime or anything that kind of has that element, murder or something to it. I feel like there's something in your human nature that has a desire to understand, first of all, why could this happen? How could this happen? And then want to figure out, how do we get justice for this person?
That's actually crucial, because my understanding of the crime novel is that people read it not for justice and not to restore order. There's a whole theory of order, chaos, order, and
right.
The crime comes to the village and creates chaos. But really, you read it for understanding. You read it for an explanation, because in real life there is no explanation.
Right.
You walk out of here and you get hit by a car in the parking lot, and somebody says, "My God, what happened?" Well, what happened was you walked out of here and there was a car in the wrong place, and
right.
There's no explanation. There's no reason for it. In a crime novel, that would be somebody who had been looking for you or looking for one of your coworkers, and you look like them, or there's a reason for it. And that's, people read crime novels because it gives that comforting sense that something happened for a reason, and you can find out the reason, and then you can get justice or not or whatever. But nothing is accidental, nothing is coincidental, and nothing is unexplained. And people really want that because you don't get that in life.
Well, and there's a draw to understanding the psychology of humans, and especially these days with elements like social media where everyone's life is so on display. I know myself, I'll sit and I'll, Facebook stalk somebody or something, and you see what they post, you see what they do, and you have this unintentional psychological thing going on to understand why they do. And I feel like it's the same kind of concept when you're dealing with crime.
Why would you do that? Yeah.
Because we want to believe that people are all innately good, but then you have things,
but if that's
terrible
true,
things
why
that
did
happen.
You do that?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So maybe the hardest question that I might ask you today, hardest or easiest, if you're reading anything, what are you reading? And if you're not, because I know you're busy right now, you are traveling all over the place, what do you want? Is there a book out or anything that you want to be reading that you are just dying to get to?
That is a really good question, and I will have to let that one
simmer.
But I'm reading right now. I read a lot of nonfiction.
Oh,
and
wow.
I'm reading a book right now on the genius of birds, which is really interesting. It's about bird migration and bird song and bird courting behavior. And I'm like turning the pages. It's terrific. I read the thing that comes to mind when people ask a question like this all the time is Lincoln and the Bardo, which I recently read. I loved it. There was a knockout. A book that I want to be. I have a stack like this.
Oh, I know. It's a terrible. It's like asking you what was your favorite book of all time or your favorite song of all. It's a hard question.
What is it? I have right now that I wish I were reading. Oh, I can't.
That's it.
Yeah, but I will think about that.
Yeah, think on that one because that you always think about what's next or what's coming next, and there's so many good books out there, and that's one thing for young readers, I hope that people are, and one of the interests of this podcast and the book festival is we want people to develop a love for reading at a young age so that as they grow up, that is something that they enjoy to do. There's so much screen time these days. And I'm an old school person. I love the feel of a book. I can't do the iPads and they're great and I'm glad we have them, but I got to have a book in my hand. You know what I mean? And so I know there's a lot of people out there that feel the same way, and so we just want to cultivate that amongst people. So who knows? Maybe we'll see a Nancy Drew come back in the youth of America.
Come on, Nancy.
I know, right? S.J. Rozan here with us today at the Mississippi Book Festival Ride On podcast. Her book, Paper Sun, coming out next month on July 2nd.
July 2nd, yeah.
You can pick it up anywhere, especially your local independent bookstore. Please make sure to grab a copy of that. And we want to thank you for joining us today and coming all the way to Jackson, Mississippi to sit down with us.
I was excited to do it, and I'm glad we did it. Yeah.
Very glad you are here. Ride On Mississippi is produced in partnership with Mississippi Public Broadcasting for the Mississippi Book Festival, the South's Literary Lawn Party.